The endless road trip. It was supposed to be the perfect road trip. A group of old friends, some time off work, and a chance to catch up as we drove across the country. It was late June, and we decided to drive from our hometown in Nashville to New Orleans. There were 5 of us: me, Josh, my girlfriend, Emily, my best friend, Dave, his brother Mark, and our mutual friend Lisa. We had Emily's father's old SUV, a comfortable Toyota Land Cruiser that had seen countless road trips before this one. It was the perfect ride for our little adventure. The plan was to take the scenic route, avoiding the interstates and enjoying the small towns and sights along the way. The first day was everything we had hoped for. We left early in the morning, the sun barely up, with a playlist of our favorite songs blaring from the speakers. We laughed, talked about old times, and made a few pit stops at quirky roadside attractions. Everything felt right. By the second day, we were deep into the heart of Mississippi. We had veered off the main highways, opting for a smaller, more picturesque road that cut through dense forests and sleepy towns. It was the kind of road that made you feel like you were traveling back in time. We stopped at a gas station just outside a small town called Willow Creek. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed in 50 years. The old man behind the counter was friendly enough, though there was something about his eyes that made me uneasy. They were too sharp, too knowing. While we filled up, he warned us about the stretch of road we were about to take. "Folks around here call it the endless road," he said, his voice low. "Strange things happen out there. Best be careful." We laughed it off. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to hear in a place like this. Local legends meant to scare tourists. We thanked him, bought some snacks, and got back on the road. As we drove, the conversation drifted towards the old man's warning. Mark joked about how we might get lost and end up driving forever. Emily laughed, but I could tell she was a little on edge. The forest around us grew denser, the trees taller and darker, casting long shadows across the road. A few hours passed, and we realized we hadn't seen another car in a long time. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of civilization. The GPS signal had died, and our phones had no service. We weren't too worried. Yet, it was part of the adventure after all. But as the sun began to set, the mood in the car shifted. The road seemed to narrow, the trees pressing in from all sides. We hadn't seen any signs or landmarks for hours, and the excitement of the trip was starting to give way to a growing sense of unease. "Shouldn't we have reached the next town by now?" Lisa asked, her voice tight with worry. I checked the map, but it didn't make sense. We should have passed several towns by now, but there was nothing, just the endless road and the darkening forest. Just as the last light of day faded, we saw a small, flickering neon sign up ahead. It was a diner, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Relieved, we pulled in, hoping to get some food, and asked for directions. The diner looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. The neon sign buzzed faintly, and the windows were covered in a layer of grime. Inside, the place was empty, except for a middle-aged waitress who greeted us with a forced smile. "Can I get you folks something?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously. We ordered some food and asked about the road. She hesitated before speaking. "You're on the endless road," she said finally. "There's no getting off it once you're on it." We laughed, but it was a hollow sound. Her words, combined with the old man's warning, were starting to get to us. As we ate, the sense of unease grew. The food tasted off, and the atmosphere was suffocating. After finishing our meals, we got back in the car, eager to leave the diner behind. But as we drove away, the road seemed even darker, the trees closing in. The headlights barely cut through the gloom, and the silence was oppressive. That's when we saw the first sign. A worn wooden board nailed to a tree, with the words "Endless Road" scrawled in faded paint. A chill ran through me, and I could see the same fear reflected in my friend's eyes. We kept driving, but no matter how far we went, the road never changed. The same trees, the same shadows. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, we saw it. The same neon sign of the diner, flickering in the distance. "We're going in circles," Dave said, his voice shaking. We pulled in again, but this time the diner was empty. no waitress, no sign of anyone. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and a sense of dread settled over us. We hurried back to the car and drove off, determined to find a way out. As the hours passed, the fear turned to desperation. We were trapped on this road, with no way off and no idea what was happening. The shadows seemed to move, whispering things I couldn't quite understand. And then, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. A woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her face pale and expressionless. I slammed on the brakes, but she didn't move. She stared at us, her eyes empty, and then slowly lifted a hand, pointing down the road. "You must leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "before it's too late." We didn't need to be told twice. We sped off, and after what felt like an eternity, the road finally began to change. The trees thinned out, and we saw the lights of a town up ahead. We pulled into the first gas station we found, exhausted and shaken. The attendant looked at us like we were crazy when we told him about the endless road. He said there was no such place, that we must have gotten lost in the forest. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. The forest loomed in the rearview mirror, dark and foreboding. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, I knew the endless road was still out there, waiting for its next travelers. The unmarked road. It was a typical summer road trip, the kind we'd taken countless times before. My best friend, Alex, and I were headed to the coast, eager to escape the city and soak up some sun. We packed the car with snacks, drinks, and a playlist of our favorite songs, ready to hit the open road. We were taking a route we'd never driven before, a back road that promised scenic views and fewer crowds. The first few hours were uneventful, the sun shining brightly as we cruised through small towns and rolling hills. But as the day wore on, the landscape began to change. The road grew narrower, the trees denser, and the sunlight faded. We stopped at a gas station in a tiny town called Willow Creek. The attendant was a strange old man with a vacant stare. He seemed more interested in the flies buzzing around his counter than in our business. As we filled up the tank, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. When we left, I glanced back at the station, but the old man was nowhere to be seen. As we continued our journey, the road became increasingly desolate. There were no other cars, no signs of civilization. The sky darkened, and a cold wind began to blow. We were starting to feel a bit uneasy, but we pressed on, hoping to reach our destination before nightfall. Then we saw it, an unmarked road winding its way into the woods. It was a narrow, dirt track, barely wide enough for our car. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to explore. The deeper we went, the stranger the surroundings became. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. We passed by a dilapidated old house, its windows boarded up and its paint peeling. A feeling of dread washed over me, and I urged Alex to turn back. But he was determined to see where the road led. As we rounded a sharp bend, we saw it, a clearing in the woods. In the center of the clearing stood a towering ancient tree, its branches reaching toward the sky. The tree was covered in strange symbols, and a dark, ominous energy seemed to emanate from it. Suddenly, a loud guttural scream echoed through the forest. We jumped, our hearts pounding. We looked at each other, fear etched on our faces. We had to get out of there. We turned the car around and raced back down the road. As we sped away, we could hear the scream again, louder and closer this time. We glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing there. We didn't stop until we reached the main road. Our hearts were still pounding, and our hands were shaking. We couldn't believe what we had seen and heard. We were both terrified, but we were also determined to forget about the unmarked road and the strange, terrifying things we had encountered. Or so we thought. Days later, I was scrolling through social media when I came across a post about a missing hiker. The hiker had been last seen in the area of Willow Creek. A chill ran down my spine as I read the description of the missing person. It sounded eerily similar to the strange old man at the gas station. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection between the unmarked road, the strange man, and the missing hiker. What had we stumbled upon that night in the woods? And what was lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim? The Vanishing Hitchhiker. The summer of '97 was one for the books. My buddies, Dave and Chris, and I had planned a road trip from Chicago to the Black Hills. We were young, full of energy, and ready to hit the open road. Our trusty steed was a beat-up Chevy Nova, a relic from the '70s that we affectionately called the Beast. The first few days were a blur of gas stations, diners, and endless miles of highway. We'd stop at roadside attractions, explore small towns, and laugh until our sides ached. But as we ventured deeper into the heartland, the atmosphere started to shift. One night, as we cruised down a deserted stretch of Interstate 80, we saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, maybe early 20s, with long dark hair and a worn-out backpack. She looked lost and alone. We pulled over and she climbed into the backseat. Her name was Sarah, and she was hitchhiking to California. She had a soft, almost ethereal beauty, and her eyes held a haunted look. As we drove, she told us about her life, her dreams, and her fears. She spoke of a dark secret, a painful past that had forced her to leave her home. We listened intently, our hearts filled with empathy. Sarah was a fascinating enigma, a mystery wrapped in a fragile human form. But as the night wore on, something about her began to unsettle us. Her stories were filled with strange coincidences, eerie encounters, and a sense of impending doom. We stopped at a desolate rest stop to grab some coffee. As we waited in line, Sarah disappeared. We searched the parking lot, the restroom, and the surrounding area, but there was no sign of her. We assumed she had simply wandered off. We continued our journey, the incident with Sarah forgotten, or so we thought. A few days later, we were driving through Nebraska when we saw a billboard advertising a missing person. The photo on the billboard was of Sarah. The date of her disappearance matched the night we picked her up. A chill ran down my spine. Had we encountered something supernatural? Had we given a ride to a ghost, a phantom hitchhiker doomed to wander the highways forever? The more I thought about it, the more questions arose. How had she known to flag us down? How had she vanished into thin air? And what was the dark secret that had haunted her? The memory of Sarah's haunting eyes and enigmatic smile still lingers, a constant reminder of the strange and inexplicable. And as I drive down the open road, I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, searching for a ride, a destination, and a way to escape her eternal fate. The incident with Sarah changed our perspective on life and the unknown. It made us realize that the world is full of mysteries, and sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. We learn to appreciate the simple things in life, to cherish the moments we have with loved ones, and to always be mindful of the unseen forces that may be lurking in the shadows. The road less traveled. Our journey continued, and with each passing mile, the landscape grew more desolate. We drove through endless fields of corn, the monotony punctuated only by the occasional roadside diner or gas station. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie. As darkness enveloped us, we decided to take a detour, a winding road that promised a shortcut to our destination. The road was narrow and poorly lit, and the further we drove, the more isolated we became. The silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the old